One. Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happenstance into this incredible dialogue with this amazing panel that I think is going to bring a lot of revelations that are going to hopefully make more sense of this chaos that we find ourselves in the midst of. And I'll do brief introductions, starting, I believe, depending on how you guys are seeing the screen. I'll start on the lower right, and that is, I believe, Nancy Levitt. Nancy is a professor of defamation and privacy, employment discrimination, and gender and justice jurisprudence, pardon me, and torts, and is a faculty advisor to UMKC Law Review. She is also a member of UMKC's Women's and Gender Studies faculty. She has previously taught courses in criminal law and constitutional law. And to her immediate left is Naomi Kahn. Naomi Kahn is an expert in family law, trusts and estates, feminist jurisprudence, reproductive technology, and aging and the law. Prior to joining the University of Virginia faculty in 2020, she taught at George Washington Law School, where she twice served as associate dean. She is the co-director of UVA's Law's Family Law Center. And then right above her is June Carbone, who has been appearing with me alongside others for the last several weeks. And of course, she is the Rabina Chair in Law, Science, and Technology at the University of Minnesota. And she is an expert in family law, assisted reproduction, property and law, medicine and bioethics. And she has also taught contracts, remedies, financial institutions, civil procedure, and jurisprudence. Now, the three of these distinguished women also work together on a book that I will put into the description below, and I would highly recommend you reading this at your earliest convenience. It's called Fair Shake: Women and the Fight to Build a Just Economy. And I want to just say at the outset of this dialogue that we have been recording for the past several weeks where we have been engaged with a kind of a who's who of legal experts and scholars and those who had worked at the highest levels of the regulatory bodies, where June has been this sort of North Star that has been able to unpack monumental history over the course of the last several decades that is so prescient that I find that she is out in front of what every major network is talking about maybe 24 to 48 hours later in a way that doesn't cover one nth of what we've been able to provide information for. So I thank you so much for that, June. But I think I want to start off with you, June, just because we've obviously had this dialogue going for a couple of weeks. Can you make sense to me at the moment, given where we're going to go with this dialogue, this overwhelming sense that the Trump administration and all things, I like to call it Elon Trump, right? The Elon Trump presidency. But we've already unpacked that everything that we're seeing is illegal, but they're not being stopped. And they're targeting the most vulnerable in our society, utilizing many of the same techniques that, of course, your scholarship has evolved and unpacked for literally decades. Can you lead us into this dialogue and kind of give us some I don't know, context as to problem, hopefully leading into more development of understanding?
Okay, so as we've talked in previous episodes, our book, uh, Fair Shake: How Women Lose in Women's Fight for a Just Economy, used to be called Shafted: How Women Lose in a Winner-Take-All World. Simon and Schuster wanted an upbeat message. But what we found in that book, in every chapter, to our surprise, was a story that could be the story of Elon Musk. The book came out in May 2024 with Elon Musk in the first chapter. And that is what this is a system of personalized power where the CEO operates as dictator, according to Ellen Greenspan, citing the development with approval, acquires power by making everybody insecure, firing lots of people, pitting people against each other, and then succeeds by breaking the rules and getting away with it. And we asked in the book, we tried very hard for Simon and Schuster to make the book optimistic. We had a hard time. But what were examples of successful counterpoints? Their collective power. You see it with the Me Too movement. But where you see it systemically is unions. And so our book, the first chapter in our book, is about Walmart, about the largest sex discrimination class action in American history, ended by the Supreme Court in a nakedly ideological 5-4 vote, at odds with prior precedent. And then we saw the interviews with the women who had been involved in the litigation, and they said the only real hope is unionization. Unionization in the middle of the 20th century was the counterpoint to the lawless power of capitalists. Unionization today gets you far more gender and racial equality than you see in other workplaces. But unionization is also a counter to the idea of the CEO as God. And where you see the worst abuses, Walmart, um, uh, and Musk's companies, Amazon, what you also see are efforts to crush unionization and worker power. That's the counterpoint politically. It's also the counterpoint um, legally, because what unions do in the modern era is they represent whistleblowers. They represent people who feel they're being retaliated against because they complain about sex discrimination. They represent people who say, when you make us work 26 hours in a row, product quality on Tesla decline. And they also have been the backbone of the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party and Republican Supreme Court justices have, in the modern era, opposed unions tooth and nail. And so the story of power is a story also about the decimation of worker rights, about collective action in a variety of forms.
Well,
I should, sorry.
well, look, Bernie Sanders has been on this anti-oligarchy awareness tour with AOC for the past couple of days. And what I'm reminded of what June had kind of prefaced, is that I think people are desperate to see where is the power of the bulwark against this hijacking of democracy and the law, and hijacking of systems that we all, I think, for the most of our lifetimes, going back to the 70s, because of a lot of things that obviously came from much of your prescient work and what you guys have been in the midst of this whole time. But I'm remiss to think that I know that Sean Fain was obviously supportive of the Biden campaign. We collectively, the people that I work with on deep level corruption and financial fraud in the markets and so on and so forth, have an awareness of that bulwark. But I wonder, and I guess I'll turn it over to you, Naomi, in that context, it does, in a sense, make a common sense sort of resolution to the problem that organization one, the power of numbers, but within systems, have to be the counter to this hijacking of, let's call it, the unitary presidency.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's right. One of the things to add to June's description of the power of unions is that unions are currently engaged in litigation. They've been on the front lines of fighting back against what's going on with the Elon Muskification of the government. And so they're the ones, there's some of the ones that are bringing the lawsuits to try to stop the firing and the gutting of public service of government employees. And so they've been fighting. And it's interesting that people in the public sector are much more likely than people in the private sector to be members of unions. The other thing to say about unions is, as June said, we tried to tell a somewhat more hopeful story in our book. I should note that we started the book when Hillary Clinton was running for president, so it's taken a long time. And the book came out just before the 2024 election. And we were trying to tell a somewhat more hopeful story at the end. And our last set of chapters start with a story of unions, start with a story of how collective action can really fight against the fascism that we're seeing. That's what's been going on. That's what's gone on in other countries, which have much stronger labor union participation and much stronger labor union roles. So unions really do, they're not the answer, they are one of the answers. And later on, I'm happy to talk about some of the statistics about how unions don't necessarily cause increased democracy, but they're correlated with less restrictive voting laws in states, for example. So they're incredibly powerful, well beyond the numbers that join unions.
Nancy, I'll turn this question to you, picking up where Naomi left off. And boy, do I appreciate, Ms. Khan, that you had recognized the F word in there, the fascist part of it, because I always consider this corruption creates fascism. But yet, I say this to some of my partners sometimes and my colleagues, and I say, what we are is corporate fascists. And they say, well, but that's redundant. And then they, kind of laugh about it. But no, this is absolutely terrifying based on the work that you guys are revealing. And Nancy, the nature of the body politic, the law, the groups of obviously organized labor is seemingly to me, from where I'm sitting, really the only sort of bulwark slash leverage point to be able to push back against this creeping authoritarianism. How does that play out, and what are the challenges based on your research and what you guys bring to the fore? But how does that work with all of the marginalized groups within? Because what I continue to consider is that on the whole, in democracy, we have seen, because of social media, silos, whether it's Me Too, whether it's Black Lives Matter, or a whole contrast of different groups within situations, as opposed to a unified group, whereas unions with a company might offer that sort of opportunity. Am I thinking along the right lines here?
I think you are, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the body politic. It may be that it's not only unions that are the heart of collective action. They've certainly, as Naomi said, been at the forefront of it. There's a case filed in federal district court in DC, the Alliance for Retired Americans, where a group of labor unions have, and they're representing federal employees. They've sued the Secretary of the Treasury, alleging that individuals affiliated with DOJ have been granted unauthorized access to sensitive Treasury Department records. Similarly, there's an AFSCME suit filed in the federal district court in Maryland, where labor unions sued the Social Security Administration and DOJ, challenging access to sensitive personal data. So they have structures in place to file actions, and they have been effectively mobilizing in that way. I'd give a little shout out here to the Just Security website, which has a litigation tracker to keep track of the litigation against the Elon Trump administration so that you don't have to. But back to the body politic. There is a slow awakening on the part of even people who voted for this administration. I live in one of what my children call the flyover states. I live in Kansas, and you may have seen or may not, because, hey, it's Kansas. The town hall that Senator Marshall had, and he was sort of run out on the rails within 20 minutes by farmers who were saying, you campaigned on the promise to support farmers, and what's this with the deprivation of funding to USAID? You ran on the promise to bring grocery prices down. That's not going so well. You referred, Patrick, to the idea of siloing, and I think that's a really important concept, because when we look at collective actions, and I'm thinking everything from I don't know, Lysistrata, the comedy by Aristophanes, the play, 400 BC, up to the Screenwriters Guild, right? When you see the sorts of collective action that work, Me Too, of course, you also see the sorts of connections among people beyond their individual silos. And that's where the power of numbers gets even bigger when there is dialogue, there is talking across platforms, there are collaborators. I mean, this is the way that the movement morphed into the suffrage movement, right? The people who were anti-abolitionists originally said, wait a minute, this isn't all just about people of color. What about women too? So I think you're right. Thinking of ways to get out of the silos of individual issues and also to mobilize individuals who are at this point very tempted to put their heads in the sand and not look.
Well, and I think that's probably a challenge throughout every era, right? Is to find the courage. But boy, I'll tell you, June has been leading with courage every step of the way. And what I couldn't, get out of my mind after June had laid this out, not to mention the progressive eras and all of the challenges that we've had to face all the way through the incredible sacrifice through World War II, right? But June had laid out the nature of Jack Welch and the rank and yank and all of these elements in her career that led, further into your collective work. But June, the wholesale firing of workers to allow CEOs to appoint cronies seems to me to be the actuality of Doge. Like it's like
Yes.
we know Elon didn't just snap his finger and go, "Hey, I've got an idea." Can you comment on that?
Sure, it's about power. There was a recent discussion. Is there a plan behind Doge, or are they willy-nilly doing random things? And one of the commentaries is that what Musk did at SpaceX, not just at Twitter, is to put enormous pressure on his workers, to fire people, to understaff, and then see, okay, who screams the loudest? Then we can rehire there. Now, this is somebody who's in control, who is cutting not to the bone, below the bone, letting people manage with understaffed resources. And then only if, you know, too many spaceships crash, do you adjust the quality control issues underlying this. And the person who was commenting on this was talking about, but in an engineering culture, you have engineers who know what are going on, who can give you very quick feedback. The plane crashed, therefore something is wrong. When you think about that, though, think about who pays the price. The workers who were fired, the people on the plane that crashed. With the spaceships, people aren't dying. But all of the things that go wrong are simply incidental to getting things done faster, cheaper. That's the mindset. And that's what makes CEOs rich. Now, take that mindset and apply it to the federal government. It's mind-boggling. And it's mind-boggling because federal employees are among the last folks left who represent the old order. The old order is one where you don't ask, how big is my bonus this quarter? You ask, what's the nature of the mission? You don't ask, how do I create favor with the boss? Because the permanent civil service knows the boss will be gone soon. Uh, you ask the question, what's my fealty to the job, to the country? You invoke a sense for federal employees of patriotism that when I worked for the Justice Department was real. But you also have a sense that your office stands for something more than when you win a case. At the Justice Department, it was always very clear we could not engage in the kind of aggressive litigation tactics, going to a deposition and blowing smoke, having a deposition that could easily be done in an hour lasts for 3 hours as a way of running up the cost for the other party and forcing them to settle. Those tactics were viewed as absolutely inappropriate for a government lawyer. And that both was a sense of professional ethics, but it was also a sense you have a responsibility, a sense of honor. We took very seriously about the nature of the job we were doing. It used to be corporate America that at least the managers and the mid-level executives in corporate America had that same sense of loyalty to the institution, of a sense that the job was something more than a means to, how to get a bigger paycheck or get a more prestigious job next. That has been eroded across American society. And so what we found in the book, that one of the things about gender differences is when you look at who stays and who does a good job instead of not being paid very well, uh, more women than men. There are men who do it too. But when you look at the federal government, you see an ethos that really is rooted in patriotism and in honor and in fealty to an idea of what the mission is. What Elon Musk represents when he brings in the mindset of corporate America is the employees are pieces on a chessboard. The mission, the mission is not worth it because anything worth doing, private business can do better through the profit motive with CEOs cashing in. That the people who are hurt are like rocket ships blowing up. They're incidental speed bumps on the road to Elon Musk greatness. And so when you say institutionally, where are the forces that can say no to that mindset? The last place left where they have not been defeated, in my view, is the federal government and the US military. And they will be defeated by the end of this administration in those locales.
Yeah, boy, I'll tell you though, at the beginning when we saw the purge at the FBI and then the subsequent stuff at DOJ, and I mean, I know who Pam Bondi is and where she came from, and then ultimately, at the military with, I definitely want to get to this part, the DEI scenario. But to your point, and further, I want to emphasize this to all that is watching this. June and these women and others that we've been interacting with have shown, and this was my discovery, because when I started my journey right after the 2008 great financial crisis, the way I framed this in my mind was, I'm not expendable. Chances are you're not either. And I was thinking to myself, why don't we all share that sort of composite reality? And, that's because of this effect of these incredibly sophisticated but diabolical approaches that you guys reveal in your work. And I want to leave this question open-ended to see if maybe all of you will respond to this or how, whatever direction it might take. But I mean, there's issues of sexual harassment, pay disparities, and all of those sorts of things that undermine diversity, but then again, silo people in a way where they become vulnerable versus the collective of the union, for example, as a bulwark. Can you guys pick up on that concept?
Naomi, Nancy, should we talk about Me Too?
Sure, I'm happy to start us there. One of the things we looked at to figure out where and when collective action had been successful was the Me Too movement. And what we said was collective action and sunlight are really the best responses to what we term the winner take all economy. Women fight back most effectively when they expose ugliness, right? For centuries, women suffered indignities, assaults, and silence has never helped women. You know the story of Me Too. 2017, actor Alyssa Milano tweeted the term that an activist named Tarana Burke had developed in 2006, hashtag Me Too. Within 1 year, there were 19 million Me Too tweets, and it was a call for action, for accountability, rather than a source of shame. Me Too involved turning the tables on those who use the accumulation of power to ensure their own invulnerability. So Me Too served, as we say in the book, as a form of jujitsu, turning the power of celebrated men to act with impunity into a weapon against them, using their very celebrity to topple them. And Me Too, as you know, has had stunning impacts. The New York Times kept a tally of more than 200 men who'd been brought down by documented reports of misconduct. It's the same idea of looking at the types of things that can bring people together and adding to it the sorts of transparency to make sure that attention is drawn to it. So while individual sexual harassment, sex discrimination suits, they're very limited. The statutorily prescribed damages have not increased since 1991. So even if one can find an attorney to file an individual lawsuit, the damages potential is hugely limited. But if sexual harassment suits are combined with, say, whistleblower allegations about a company's product safety, like Tesla, right? Those trucks that look like eighth grade shop class fails, I think they were called out, and the product recalls. The sexual harassment suits coupled with attention to product safety have the potential to embarrass corporations, and where there is harassment are often companies where there is other wrongdoing. So I think one of the places I would start and stress is to look for opportunities to figure out where both collective action and sunlight can help connect the dots between the abuse of power and the treatment of all vulnerable workers and perhaps the product.
Naomi, do you have any follow-ups to that?
I was actually going to add, going back to your question about DEI, which is currently being in the process of there's an effort to discredit it. And the language of DEI is, I think, it's hiding what's actually going on, which is the title of our book, Giving People a Fair Shake. And if you look at what actually happens in companies with diversity, their financial performance improves. There are so many benefits to diversity that there's actually, and perhaps somewhat ironically, a strong business case to be made for it. And so the anger and the frustration with DEI is misplaced. What's actually going on is that through programs that ensure that or through measure, whether there is gender or ethnic diversity, when there's measurement of that, financial performance outperforms other companies with less of it. And so, I mean, just going back to if you're looking at what makes a difference in companies with respect to culture, it's important to think about, I mean, what Nancy was talking about in terms of speaking out, joining together to talk about the sexual harassment, but also making sure that there is representation based on gender and race in leadership.
Well,
Can I? Yeah, I want to jump in on this if you don't mind. This administration could be called a predators club, and it's not accidental. Think of how many people, including Donald Trump himself, have been accused, or in Donald Trump's case, found civilly liable for sexual assault. And I want to emphasize the way that is not accidental. And one of the things we found in our book is that when you look at the kind of people, and Elon Musk is the perfect example of the psychological profile. Narcissist, a malignant narcissist. What does it mean to be a narcissist? It means you like being the center of attention. You think you were ordained by God or merit or the natural universe to be a leader. Feeling when you look at gender differences in narcissists, there are women narcissists, they also like being the center of attention. Male narcissists are more likely to feel that they are entitled to run roughshod over others. to accomplish their mission, which is so important. When you then look at sexual harassment, you also find the kind of people who think of themselves as God's gift to the world are more likely to engage in sexual harassment, and they are less sensitive to the fact that the target of their affection might object. They think their attention should be welcomed. So, what you see, in fact, is that organizations characterized by lawlessness, by the abuse of power, by the reward for those who can break the rules and get away with it, also have much higher incidence of sexual harassment, more in-group favoritism. I mean, they discriminate, let's face it. They look for buds who are like them, and they think there's nothing wrong with that. And that DEI, the obligation to actually consider people outside your immediate circle, is an affront because it's a limit on their power to pick the people they like in a system of personalized rewards. Now, there's a couple of important consequences from that. One is that if you can bring the charges, you often discover that they are a potent weapon in the press. Donald Trump's brilliance is trying to neutralize really ugly accusations against him, but other people are not so immune. And the second is the distinction between the long run and the short run. So the people who celebrate the narcissistic CEOs like Musk, who get the impossible done in a short amount of time, those companies don't do so well over the long run. So you look at Jack Welch and you find that the very things that made him an incredibly successful CEO led to the destruction of General Electric. Those tactics at Boeing led to plane crashes that at Boeing deeply damaged the corporate brand. The relentless pressure to open new accounts at Wells Fargo has meant the company hasn't been profitable and has had to pay something like $6 billion in fines, and is in deep trouble. And if you look at what is happening to Tesla right now, Musk seized on the bright shiny object, superstarting the EV market. But Teslas haven't been competitive for the last couple of years for reasons that go beyond politics. And when we first started doing this work, the study said, well, if you hire a narcissistic CEO, the companies, there are more big wins and more big losses, but they do about the same. The more recent studies today show companies headed by narcissists do worse. And so what you're talking about is a whole mindset embedded in Silicon Valley, move fast and break things, embedded in Wall Street. All that we really care about is what you did for us today, this quarter. In the long run, leads both. Sexual harassment is the tell, and it almost inevitably is more prevalent in lawless environments. And the long-term performance of the company suffers, even if the CEO walks out the door with billions.
Boy, that's an incredible tapestry, and it lends itself to all that we've learned from William K. Black by way of control fraud, and of course, within the context of modern executive compensation and all of the fraud that underpins all that. But as Nancy was talking, I was reminded about the nature of Ronan Farrow's Weinstein complicity machine. And so, from a clarification standpoint, and also these are some of the points that June, you had brought up in some previous conversations. I want to try to tie these things together because, and I think I'm going to direct this to you, Nancy, because of what you had said in your previous comment. Sexual harassment obviously has a certain component of it that, stands in a certain remedy, a certain sort of indictment. But there's also like what June had just covered, predation, right? But systemic predation. And so when you think about the Weinstein complicity machine, the sexual harassment was clear. I mean, the rape was clear, but it was in service of control of an outcome for the business model that put Weinstein in a specific catbird seat, if you will, to control the outcomes of all of the people that he both metaphorically and physically raped, right? There was a point to the madness that was more than a sexual interaction. It was control of the actual professional trajectory. Now, June had brought up to our previous conversation with the research that you guys found. There was a methodology within obviously Walmart to identify women in a specific routine sort of scenario where they would be. I don't want to go into more definition of it, but you guys had foundings. There was a systemic causality of specific things that took place in that sort of paradigm, I guess I'd like to call it. Can you comment on that? You're on silent.
Sure. I think you make the point well when you say that there is systemic predation and it's in service of a larger goal. In the book, we talked about the case of Betty Dukes. She was the plaintiff in the largest sex discrimination suit in the country's history. It was no accident that her suit was against a corporation that has been ranked #1 in the country for wage and hour theft. And what Sam Walton did, among many other things, was to find women who would be, as Betty Dukes was, a greeter. And she wanted to move into away from an hourly position into a salaried position. What she didn't understand, she thought she was discriminated against because she was a Black female. She was discriminated against because she cared about other people. There was no way she was going to be a manager in Sam Walton's universe, because the managers were the people who encouraged the workers to work overtime, but not report those hours. The managers were the ones who would be moved from store to store in order to prevent them from getting too attached to the workers. The managers were the ones who were effectuating the wage and hour violations. The Supreme Court ultimately said her class action was too big. There couldn't have been any common action, one of the requirements of class actions, because all of these managers at stores across the country were making the decisions individually, even though Walmart had such tentacles of control that Walmart prescribed the temperature in the freezers for storing food. So it is this idea of a system of controls, and controls toward what end. And I think that's a really important point. When we talk in the book, we get a lot of questions about what should women do? Should women lean in? Should women lean out? Should women be girl bosses? And our point is we have not written a self-help book telling women how to navigate a broken system. And women are really the canaries in the coal mine for a system that affects workers, male and female. And what to do with that system is really the focus of the book.
Wow. And that really touchstoned me in many things where, as a non-expert and somebody who's just trying to absorb and understand, but with a sense of what's happening in the larger picture, right? So what I want to touch down upon, and maybe I'll direct this to you, Naomi, first, but I would encourage everybody else to try to chime in here to make this thing more complete. So I hope I don't really screw this analogy up, but in nature, we see that when certain flocks are isolated, they're more vulnerable to predation, first and foremost. And so we started off with this concept of the union right, that operates a specific way within the mechanics that has certain leverage based on the product for the shareholder and the CEO, and everybody's in it together. But at the same time, we know how the CEO can manipulate through some of these tactics that you've talked about. I'm assuming far beyond the scope of women in this specific arena, but obviously maybe minorities and whatever else. And now the American people and people around the world writ large, right? We're dealt the cards we know how we play. So we deal with the four corners of our existence. We got to survive. We got to get on the treadmill. We got to provide for our families. We try to go to wherever we go. So we don't have a lot of time and bandwidth a lot of the times to be able to really get the details that we instinctually feel that maybe we've been targeted. Maybe we've been set up to fail. Maybe we're a part of something that's bigger than us, but yet we feel overwhelmed by it and we don't want to ask questions or rock the boat because we need that income to be able to provide for our families. So you've got this imbalance of power. And the only thing that I've heard that is a meaningful response to this hijacking that we are all in the midst of, which is the result of 4 decades of this stuff going out of control. Primarily the law not being equal, disparity of wealth, and unfortunately CEOs getting away because of the nature of the legal system with a lot of these things over the course of now decades, right? To the point where it now blew up our democracy. So Naomi, sorry for that long-winded ramp up, but I'm just somebody trying to understand how we as a people become that bulwark that the citizenry was designed within the Constitution to respond to tyranny. I hate to use loaded terms like that, but I mean, it just seems that's what we're in the midst of.
That one of the themes I think that the three of us, or four of us actually, are focusing on today is the idea of collective action and the idea that it's more than any single one of us, that it's all of us who have to act together, and that it's collective action. It's not being the first to cave. It's supporting others to make sure that they don't need to cave. And so one of the answers is this whole idea of people working together, of not being the law firm that gives in to various demands to take certain actions, of responding by working together with others, by seeking solidarity in working with others. And so, although we've spent some time talking about unions, each of us, regardless of whether we're a member of a union, can work within neighborhood groups, within larger groups, to try to make a difference. One of the, as Nancy said, we're often asked sort of what can individual people do in their workplaces, and one of the things is finding networks wherever you are and working within those networks. That's the start. That's obviously not the full answer. But I think each of us needs to feel empowered that we really can make a difference. But it is, as you said, it's bigger than any one of us. And each of us is facing all kinds of pressures within our own workplaces, within our own communities.
Well, I'm going to turn this back to you, June, because we talked about this in our last dialogue with our other panelists. But Bill had recommended a plan of action, particularly with state AGs, to be able to respond in kind to deal with all of the actions that are necessary to thwart this attack by, let's say, Doge is the shortcut, but there's even more to it. I mean, it's an all-out assault on everything. And so, interestingly enough, it's like the Trump administration is that thing that nobody can avoid, right? We've been dealing with all of these scenarios for now decades. But now this feels like it's overwhelming everyone, particularly the democracy, right? And so, to the point that Naomi just made, I mean, we just saw in the last week, it remind me of the White Shoe Law Firm, a very powerful
Always.
Always.
Paul Weiss, yes, that just is now providing $40 million of their services pro bono to do what exactly? I mean, maybe you can take that and then kind of encapsulate that into the challenge to the legal profession, but in context to what obviously we the people are facing, and I'll keep it at that.
Okay, we have to think of this as structural. So as I said, I talked to a Paul Weiss partner who said, hey, yeah, it looks bad $40 million to do Trump's bidding. But this is a Jewish law firm. The main cases that do Trump's bidding are fighting anti-Semitism, and they do a lot of pro bono work anyway. So they didn't feel they agreed to anything they wouldn't have been willing to do otherwise. But there's something else in that, and that's that uh, what they feared. What they feared were not the sanctions in the immediate Trump order. They could have beaten those in court. What they feared was the entire federal government getting orders, don't return Paul Weiss's phone calls in any case. And I think we're about to see the same thing happen with the tariff battle. That is, the strength of a well-functioning, honest, transparent economy is that we are integrated. We're connected to each other. We do trade with Canada and Mexico, and the fact we do trade with them makes automobile manufacturing more efficient. That interconnectedness has been made a source of vulnerability. How do you fight back against them? Well, one of the things we pointed out is you've got to go after the ugliness. So, in the first Trump administration, which was arguably one of the more corrupt, maybe the most corrupt in history, the number of cabinet members who had been charged with various forms of misconduct, Steve Bannon is still supposed to go on trial for ripping off the supporters who were trying to fund the private building of the wall. Okay. Uh, I suspect virtually every high-ranking official in this government is guilty of something. That is, of fraud, of the head of the Office of Religion in the government is hawking, something that she's selling, a clear abuse of her governmental office. We know that Trump is involved in Bitcoin and these kinds of things. My guess is the amount of sexual harassment taking place in this administration that has not yet been made public rivals the, the release of government secrets. But the individuals are not as immune as the Supreme Court has made Donald Trump. So that question, it is our interconnections. I will say, in the way of amusement, the latest announcements is how many of the passwords of the individuals involved in that, text message chain on Signal involving the attacks in the Middle East. They've been released too. They're all over the web. So what you have is an administration that is exploiting the vulnerabilities that come from interconnection with the federal government. And the flip side of that ought to be two things, I think. One, I'd like to see a national call to restore honor. What honor means is you don't lie. You don't roll the dice with somebody else's life. You don't promote malignant narcissists. But when people are obviously self-dealing, as this administration is, you call them to account individually. You can bring civil actions against them if there's no possibility of criminal prosecutions. And I think you're going to see a level of sexual abuse. You're seeing it already. I mean, our little story in Minnesota is down the street from my house. There's a state senator from rural Minnesota, married, 4 kids, and he was caught in a sting operation, setting up an underage sex worker.
Wow.
The police nabbed him. He's been forced to resign. And the first thing he did was to destroy all kinds of evidence. So they didn't grant him bail, but apparently they're going to have him in a halfway house, and his wife has filed for divorce. I think, and this is the guy who tried to introduce a bill in the Minnesota legislature to outlaw Trump derangement syndrome. Okay, you can't make this stuff up. But my point is accountability comes in a number of forms. And when you look at abuse of power, sexual predators, people who lie, people who cheat in their personal financial dealings, and people who misuse government authority, that's a package. It's a package in corporate America. It is a package in this administration. And we need to be vigilant about being on the lookout for it and on organizing to shine the spotlight on the abuses. That's what Me Too did. And I think it's not accidental that some of the worst offenders were people in a system of personalized power who abuse that power, not just with women, but in lots of different ways.
Wow. We're coming to a close of our time together, and I'm going to hopefully just leave this question for all of you to maybe provide your closing thoughts. But I found it really interesting from the get-go here that we started with unions and the solidarity of obviously sticking together to break through specific sort of indignities and that sort of thing based on the control fraud. We learned a long time ago through William K. Black the nature of predation, but particularly in his personal experience where like June had just commented on it, and that's why I think the whole thing is like a step and repeat of the last 30 years, that the former CEO of Lincoln Savings, who wanted to kill Black dead, right? Charlie Keating, he was one of the biggest contributors to an anti-porn crusade, right? And by the way, that carried through, June, we found out later, that disseminated the ability for the FBI to staff properly the white collar fraud division that would ultimately drop the ball on the criminal referrals that could have held the 2008 great financial crisis. But that's part of it, right? You destroy the systems that could actually hold you accountable, to your point, right? And so the idea that unions in many lexicons have been shamed because, I don't know, through cultural sort of mandate, whether it's the 50s with The New Irishman is the film by Scorsese that was with the Teamsters and some other conflagrations of corruption and things like that. There's been this ongoing sort of not only attack to decimate the unions and the strength and the credibility, but to your point, integrity above all else, right? So when I hear Bill and I hear June and I hear some of their colleagues and you folks here as well, we all know that a plane can't fly without integrity. Systems can't function without integrity. And what we're in the midst of is the destruction of the integrity of the law, the rule of law, the ability to get the investigations, to hold power to account. But yet, at the end of the day, the bulwark is the union, right? It's not just unions, but it's the union of the American people, which we once were against the Confederacy, which if we got to do a quick correlation, yeah, I mean, these guys are the Confederacy. They're the plantation model. They want to turn everybody into slaves, exploit, and then put us on collateralized debt obligations. And they were doing that during slavery. So just in closing, guys, with your expertise and your inspiration, and I loved how you've really fanned this out to incorporate all of us. It seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong here as you take us out of here, if you're not part of the 0.001%, you've been rug pulled. Thoughts? Closing comments?
Naomi?
Or it looks like Nancy's about to say something.
Okay, I don't have her on the screen.
Just a couple of random thoughts. One is I found myself in a fairly anomalous position of cheering for Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who still believe in the rule of law. So celebrating the people who believe in the rule of law is important, particularly with the flood the zone strategy and courts trying to catch up and the vilification of judges and journalists. There is the effort to decimate federal agencies. The Federalist Society message is state and local control is so important. Okay, fine. Wake up and run for the state school board because that's where power is going to be. If you're homebound, there's a great app, but the 5 calls app. You can spend 5 minutes and make 5 calls to your senators. Trying to avoid efforts to turn the public against the mainstream media. You may have seen I think it was March, the attempted purge of federal government agency words to limit or to avoid using. I think we ought to use those words and use them a lot. So a couple of random thoughts on what perhaps, even though, as we all believe, the answer is structural, the answer is systemic, but individual people can do small things.
Okay,
Al-
go
Oh,
ahead.
along those lines, June talked about the need for transparency and the need for integrity and honor. And yes, it's incredibly important to make sure that we keep the facts out there, that we keep the stories, that things like Signalgate don't get overwhelmed by tariffs or by other things that are happening, that we continue to show, that we continue to shed light. That's, of course, one of the important steps. The others are acting on that, taking actions, working. There's Jess Piper, the View from rural Missouri, working on issues. Yes, we're working on issues around the country. It's not just in the, I mean, the three of us are lawyers, right? We think the law is incredibly important. It's not just the law. We need to move beyond thinking about courts. Even as we applied the rule of law, it's not just courts, it is action law far beyond the courts that that's what caused democracy to happen here, and that's what's going to continue democracy here.
June, anything else?
Yeah, I'd like to echo that this is structural too. So when we talk about John Roberts, I'm not going to talk about Amy Coney Barrett, who hasn't been on the court long enough. But John Roberts' mission has been repeal the New Deal. That is to undo the great advances that came with Franklin Roosevelt in terms of a larger government with a more active role in the economy. And the symbol of that is unionization. This court has undermined unions, right, left, and center. It has tried to destroy the economic base of unions, which is a mandate that every member of a workplace that has been unionized pays fees, the union shop. Uh, they've and Roberts is as much a part of that as Alito, who has written these opinions. And so when we think about it, we need to put back in place the structural forces that can represent different viewpoints. And I would add, almost all of these people are unpopular. And they're unpopular for good reason. They say no. They say no to powerful actors. And I will say with unions, we spent one of our chapters is on teachers, and the teachers have gotten frustrated with their unions for not being progressive enough. And the activist teachers have created alternative groups that represent teachers who in the 2020 elections were very effective at mobilizing on the ground in places like Colorado and Illinois for a number of ballot measures and New Jersey. Chris Christie, by the time he left office as governor, was was in the toilet in terms of political popularity because he had taken on the teachers' unions, who were not particularly popular in New Jersey. And the teachers fought back. And they fought back by showing up at his rallies, by being there saying, "Why are you attacking the teachers?" And there's an iconic picture of Chris Christie wagging his finger at a teacher who had the temerity to stand up to him. And every time an incident like that happened, his popularity fell. I think we need an image of the people in power today as bullies, which they are, and the people collectively who are hurt by these measures rising up. So, collective action, I'm all in favor of it.
Well, and that's inspiring because courage is contagious and knowledge is power. And to the audience out there and everybody else who comes in contact with this, I mean, it's research and it's expertise and it's the ability to provide the information to make the picture complete so that we do have a reason and causality to rise and unify is really based on the assault that we're all in the midst of. That's, decades and maybe a millennia in the making, but it's the same battle that's always been fought. But the only way you can power through it is when we're together. I frequently say when you live in truth, you live in light, and when you lie, you're depraved. So, on that note, that's a pretty easy sort of comparison, and we see it play out. And honor really is the guiding light. And I guess that's the reason why the Statue of Liberty has the guiding light for freedom and justice and the balance of liberty and justice for all. So, on that note, I'm going to say thank you, and I will finish with the book again. Is called Fair Shake, Women and the Fight to Build a Just Economy. I will leave links to that in the description. And I will thank you all for your time. And I will bid you adieu and say thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.